Hey guys, this is Josh Peak. I'm your host of The Josh Peak Show. You can find my website at www.joshpeak.com. Today is going to be a very special podcast. I think they all are, right? I say that every time, but this is with Corey DeAngelis, and I've been chatting back and forth with him for months now, and I've really been watching him. We homeschool, and so here's a guy that has really hit the scene big. He's been on Fox Business. He's been on a lot of the major networks, and he is Executive Director of Educational Freedom Institute, Director of School Choice at Reason Foundation, Adjunct Scholar at the Cato Institute, and just an awesome guy, very knowledgeable. You better be on your toes when you're interviewing him. So you're really going to like this show because he gets into some of the issues that I like to talk about. Before we get into the show, there's, I obviously, a lot of times I get emailed or text about what are some of the tools I use to grow my business, the podcast, my digital marketing agency, and that. So I'm going to showcase two products I use. Number one, you hear me talk about it all the time. If you're not building a list, an email list, you have to ask yourself why. That's the gold, is your database. You have to develop a subscriber list, whether if it's for, just communication or marketing your products or services. I use Aweber. You can find that on my resources page at joshpeak.com. I've used it for years. Some people use other platforms, but they've always been good for me. The deliverability rate is phenomenal. And if it's not broke, why try to fix it? It's a phenomenal tool. Aweber. You can find that on my resources page at joshpeak.com. Also, I recorded this podcast. It was the first time I've ever used it, StreamYard. And StreamYard is really cool because if you're broadcasting live, it will push to Facebook, any one of your pages or groups, LinkedIn, Twitch, YouTube, which you can also find this on my YouTube channel, youtube.com. Just look up Josh Peak or Ask Josh Peak. And I love it. Great tool. But it simultaneously broadcasts to all these channels at the same time. So you're talking about creating content. You can create a tremendous amount of content with this. So anyways, enjoy this interview with Corey DeAngelis. Again, you can find me at joshpeak.com. Instagram at Josh Peak, Twitter at Josh Peak, and then of course on Facebook you just type in Josh Peak. So enjoy the show, and I hope everything's going great with everybody. Thank you.
Josh Peak Show.
Well, hey everybody, this is Josh Peak with the Josh Peak Show, and today I have Corey DeAngelis with me. I've been wanting to have this interview for quite some time. As most people know, we homeschool, and I'm a big proponent of school choice. And so I found Corey, online. I'd interviewed Carrie McDonald. I found Corey, and I thought, man, where have these people been? Right? And Corey. Just an introduction, he's an executive director at the Educational Freedom Institute. He is the director of School Choice at Reason Foundation and adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. And so, Corey, I'm excited to have you on.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. This is way overdue.
It is. Well, like we were talking before, there's a lot going on right now. In Oklahoma, we're a little bit more conservative than most states, but so I think some schools are going to open up, but there are, a lot of it is going to be, it's going to be virtual. And I don't think most people have the answers yet. I think we're still waiting. I think they're going to wait till the last minute.
Yeah. This is why so many families are scrambling to do the homeschooling thing or even micro schools, with getting together with other families to kind of outsource that process of homeschooling and make it easier by grouping together either that way or through a homeschool co-op, because there's so much uncertainty with the public school system. But I will say in Oklahoma, it's one of the states that's actually taking a step in the right direction as far as their governor's order regarding the CARES Act funding, to take that existing federal funding and allow it to follow students to at least private schools, which are we've seen to be more likely to be willing to reopen than the public school sector. That isn't always the case, but I mean, it's obvious that there's a different source of incentives in the private sector than the public sector, in that the private school doesn't reopen, families can take their money elsewhere and leave, which could lead to a lot of private schools having to shut their doors for good. Whereas in the public sector, you don't reopen, you still get taxpayer dollars regardless of the choices of the families and what the families actually want. So I think that's why we're seeing different pushes from the different sectors. Private schools wanting to open their doors on average more so, and the public sector, you see the unions calling to not reopen. You see all these weird demands across the country tied to banning charter schools, banning private school voucher programs in order to reopen. We've seen LA, they've been calling to defund the police in order to reopen the schools and to call for Medicare for all and a wealth tax. We've seen that, and then just calls for more money from the federal government as well, or else they're saying they're not going to reopen. And on the other hand, private schools are wanting to open and serve their customers because of that different incentive structure. And I just want to be clear, that's not to say that private actors in the private sector are more moral or anything like that, or that the public sector is filled with greedy or evil people. It's not to say that at all. It's just a different set of incentives that are set up between those two sectors. So I just want to give Oklahoma kudos for being one of the few states that are actually doing the right thing and taking a step in the right direction as far as restructuring those CARES Act dollars.
Yeah, Kevin Stitt's great. He's done a very good job in terms of when it comes to, and I think he's more. It seems to me he's more school choice as well. We're seeing that. Obviously Donald Trump has made it very clear he's school choice. I think the choice is pretty clear. So let's talk about what's going on. I mean, what you were talking about earlier, what's going on.
Today's a good day to talk about more of what the unions are doing when they're partnering up. They've actually built a coalition. If you go to demandsafeschools.org, you'll see what I'm talking about. You don't just have to take my word for it. But today, August 3rd, is their National Day of Resistance. It's 10 teachers unions from big cities across the United States, including Boston, the state of Massachusetts overall, Milwaukee, Racine, Little Rock, Los Angeles, other big cities, including joining up with the Democratic Socialists of America. And they're calling for a lot of different things to reopen schools, but some of them that I'll list off really quickly is they want to ban standardized testing, which I'm not even a proponent of standardized testing myself. I think they probably do more harm than good. Mm-hmm. But when you couple that with the other demands, such as banning new charter schools and banning voucher programs or private school choice initiatives, this just seems like a way to avoid any form of accountability, either from the bottom up through choice or from the top down through these standardized tests, which I think the better way of true accountability is the vote, allowing people to vote with their feet. But they're calling it to ban all of those things. Then also they want police-free schools, which to me, again, I'm skeptical of having police in schools. I'd rather have private security so that you're less likely to get involved with the criminal justice system if you get in trouble at school. But again, these families, the decision of these things should be in the hands of families, not the teachers' unions. Mm-hmm. And families should be able to vote with their feet to the schools that have the best safety policy for them. They're also calling for a quote unquote massive infusion of federal money. So sure. They want a lot more money. They want to ban their competition. They want to get the police out of schools, which doesn't seem to have a lot to do with reopening schools safely. But their whole initiative is called Demand Safe Schools. And I will say I listed a few cities, and there's 10 that are officially organized with the Democratic Socialists of America. But there's also many more cities that are not included in the original 10. And I tweeted about them and listed all of the cities, tons of cities across the United States holding events that are related to this, including where I grew up, San Antonio, Texas, is doing it as well. So just go check that out. And then we've also seen the American Federation for Teachers recently announced they are the second largest teachers union in the United States. The largest one is the National Education Association, which is also the largest labor union in the United States as well. But AFT, 1.7 million members are now threatening what they call safety strikes. Again, if they don't get what they want, they're threatening to go on strike when the school year starts. And that affects the entire nation because they have members all across the nation. And look, I don't have a problem with unions demanding whatever they want to demand. I don't have a problem with unions threatening strikes. What I do have a problem with is not being able to take your money elsewhere if they are going to do so. Like, for example, if Walmart employees decide they want to go on a strike, I would be okay with them doing that. One, because it's in the private sector, but then two, it's because I know if they strike, I can shop elsewhere and they don't get to keep my money. But with the school system, it's completely backwards. If teachers go on strike or if the schools refuse to reopen, they still get to keep my money without providing me with educational services to my students that are what I deem to be adequate. So, I mean, that's how I kind of discuss this and how ridiculous it is that, you know, when if a Walmart doesn't reopen, I can take my money elsewhere. If a school doesn't reopen, I should similarly be able to take my money elsewhere, but I can't. So we're seeing, I think it's related, all of these problems on a national level of schools not wanting to reopen and employees threatening to not go back to work because they get your money regardless.
Yeah, and I had a post. I don't know if it was a meme or what. It was a post this last week on Facebook, and I remember that it definitely struck a chord with teachers. I am not against like public schooling, or I'm not against teachers or any of that. I am against. I'm not a big fan of unions. I'll just say that. But it's not that I think the teachers have been hijacked. I think I believe their hands have been tied. There's no creativity anymore because they're told what to teach, this, that, and the other. I think there's some great teachers out there that, should be allowed to teach and teach and have a little bit of flexibility and latitude. But with that being said, I am for school choice like you. We homeschool, and I think the money should go back to, like you're saying, the parents.
School choice would benefit teachers too, because it gives the school system an incentive to spend the money wisely. And when you have an incentive to spend that money wisely, you spend it on the most important aspect of the educational system, which is the teachers. And we've seen that with about 5 or 6 studies that I know of on the topic that find when there's school choice competition comes into play, whether that is through private school choice mechanisms or charter school mechanisms, the schools start to allocate more dollars towards teacher salaries because they know that, well, if they don't allocate those dollars wisely, they're going to lose their customers. Mm-hmm. And that's how competition works, right? Competition benefits the consumers in the product market, but competition in the labor market also benefits employees, the teachers themselves. You can think of from an economics standpoint, you can think about the labor market in K through 12 education as a monopsony. Everybody knows that the K through 12 education system is a monopoly, which harms consumers, but it's also a monopsony, one big employer in the system, that the employees essentially have to take those costs and benefits that go along with that employer, which is the government-run school system. That's bad for employees, and allowing for more choice benefits teachers too. And I will say that, just to clarify, you're right that being pro school choice isn't anti-public school. If you were to buy that argument, it's like saying that allowing customers to shop at Trader Joe's is anti-Walmart. No, that's not the case at all. I may like shopping at Walmart, but I also may like allowing other people to shop elsewhere. That doesn't mean I'm anti-Walmart, right? That's just the wrong way of thinking about it. It's just being pro-choice and pro-family. And that choice for a lot of people would be the public school system. They may not want to switch or take their children elsewhere, but we should also allow other families to do that, to opt for the best solution for their children. And I want to say that being pro-teacher or even being skeptical, if you're being skeptical of teachers' unions, does not mean that you're anti-teacher or that you're even skeptical of teachers themselves. I would say that the teachers' unions have been lobbying for policies overall that aren't benefiting individual teachers, but are benefiting the union leaders, in that you look at the top line data from 1992 to 2014. Ben Scafferty from Kennesaw State University highlighted this, and I'm sure, Josh, you know about this already, but for the listeners, real per pupil education expenditures over that period increased by 27%. And for people who don't know what real means, that's the same thing as inflation adjusted. They have increased by 27% in real inflation adjusted terms, but teacher salaries in real terms have dropped by 2%. And the reason for that is that we've just put more and more people into the school system and haven't spent the money wisely. It's gone towards administrative bloat. And from a competitive standpoint and from a union leader standpoint, that's beneficial for them because having more people in the system increases union dues, whereas increasing teacher salaries does not increase union dues, and putting more people into the system benefits the unions as well, and that it gives them a bigger voting bloc and more political power. So there's a disconnect between the interests of individual teachers and the interests of the union leaders. So you can absolutely be skeptical of unions and union bosses and also be pro individual teacher at the same time. And I would argue that school choice is the best way to benefit teachers.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing that in Oklahoma too. We're seeing now, you have to go look at it, Google it, but Epic, which is a charter school. I don't know if you've heard of Epic.
It's a virtual charter, right?
It is. It's become the largest. It's become the largest in Oklahoma now, as far as for students. It's become I don't know if you call it a district or what. It's the largest, basically, school system in Oklahoma right now. There's just so many people that are leaving the public school system and going towards Epic charter. And of course, you've got you got all kinds of media outlets that are against Epic. They're trying to. It's like they don't want them to migrate over. But this kind of segues into what you've been talking a lot about. And I've started to do some research, which is micro schools. And when you look at what a teacher can make there or a teacher can make at Epic, I mean, it's crazy the money, the difference between a public school and say Epic or going to a micro school.
Yeah, I don't know the individual salaries for Epic, but I will say that charter schools have a stronger incentive to allocate the dollars to the families. But I also will at the same time note that across the country, I don't know the numbers in Oklahoma, but across the country, the charter schools typically get fewer dollars per child than the traditional public schools, which is a huge injustice that more people need to call out, because why should a family and a child be worth less because the traditional public school didn't work for them? Why should they lose their public education dollars, a fraction of those dollars, just because they want to switch to a public charter school, which is still a public school, including, Epic charter schools are public schools in Oklahoma as well. So people should get the same amount of money regardless of the type of education that works best for them. Even if that's a virtual education, families shouldn't lose that money. And from the most recent report that I've done on the topic, we found that the charter schools in the cities that we looked at got about 27% less funding on a per pupil basis than the traditional public schools. And so with the micro school concept, again, just to reiterate for the listeners, it's about 5 to 10 students getting together in a household. A lot of people in the homeschool community don't want to call this homeschooling because it's not in your own home. It's not you with your own child. But it's kind of like it's a home-based education, we can call it, I guess, in that 5 to 10 children get together in a household, and you as a family, let's say I'm a single parent or I'm a low-income family that relies on those two incomes, and I can't make it work for whatever reason with my schedule this year, I can outsource that process to another household, have my child get that one-on-one attention, or not one-on-one, but a more personalized attention at least, and have the more student-centered approach. And get a lot of the benefits of homeschooling, not all the benefits, but still allow me to go back to work. This fall. That would be.
Would that have one school teacher, or would it be
It depends how you set it up. You can have a homeschool co-op type a thing where you get 5 families together, for example, and I could do the math teaching. Josh, you could do the English one day, and so you can kind of make it work that way. Or you could have it like Prenda micro schools based in Arizona. I think they have schools in other states as well. I don't know how many other states, but I do know they have schools in other states as well, but they're based in Arizona. Their model is that you have one guide, they call them. They don't even call them teachers. It's a guide, because I think they understand that most learning occurs through student interest and students kind of seeking out things that they want to learn about. And you can still have the guide there to make sure that the student is on task, and to make sure that they're there to watch out for the safety of the children and to watch for questions that the children may have for clarification purposes. But with Prenda, most of the learning is through the student pursuing their interests. And so that's the way Prenda does it. So you only need one guide. And I talked to their CEO, Kelly Smith, out of Prenda Micro Schools in Arizona. And he told me that about 60% of the revenues that come in go directly to the teachers. And when you look at the public school system, if you just look at the overall, how much we spend, over $15,000 per child in the public school system, about 25 students per classroom, and teachers make about $60,000. I think about 15 to 20% of the public school expenditures go directly to the teachers. Where at Prenda, in the micro school setting, where you can cut out a lot of the bloat, you can allocate more of those dollars directly to the teacher. And I will say, Prenda already works with the school choice programs that they have out there in Arizona. They have things called education savings accounts. So most listeners are probably familiar with vouchers, where if you opt out of your public school, you get to take some of those education dollars in the form of a voucher to a private school of your choosing. With an education savings account, a lot of those dollars, or a fraction of those dollars, will go into something called an education savings account, and you can use those funds like you would with a voucher for private school tuition and fees, but you could also use it for any other government approved education expenditure, including going to a micro school or to offset homeschooling expenses. So we already have systems that are doing this, and I think that's the future of education, to allow the money to follow the child. And just do a quick multiplication there. $115,000 per student. If you get 10 students in a household, you can pull in $150,000 in revenues. Obviously, not all of that would go to the teacher, but if you multiply that out by 60%, the teachers would be making more in that setting than they would in the public school system, and they'd have a class size that is far smaller than what we see in the public school system. You only have 10 students as opposed to the 20 to 30 students that you're seeing in the public school system. So that again just shows you that this can benefit, this kind of set up by getting money more directly to families, and the teachers can benefit the families, obviously, but it benefits the teachers as well by giving them more autonomy, smaller class sizes, and potentially higher salaries if you can get those dollars to follow the child. And I will say, another part of the national debate right now is we've seen a lot of outlets, including Washington Post twice already, Salon, Good Morning America, and a couple of other outlets. They keep pointing out that, hey, there's this cool thing going on. They call them pandemic pods. It's essentially, they're talking about families getting together to do the homeschooling thing, or microschooling thing, or homeschool co-op setup. And they're pointing out that this is cool and all, but this could lead to inequities. They've argued that it's going to be the most advantaged families that are doing this. I will argue that, one, less advantaged families do have the means to be able to seek out these options as well, but it may not be economically feasible if you have to pay for a private tutor, which may cost a lot of money right now, and a lot of families may not be in the position to do so. And so all of these outlets are identifying a potential problem of inequities expanding through microschooling in the current school system, but they're not seeing the obvious solution. And I don't know if it's willful ignorance, or if they're just not thinking the way that I think about the school system, that if the money followed the child, you'd allow less advantaged families to take advantage of these alternative options as well. Why would you, not see that as an obvious solution? If you gave low-income families $15,000 per child, they would have so many more options and access to these micro schools this fall, and that would be an equalizer in society to allow more families to get these options as well. And before we move on to another topic, I just want to bring it back to the unions real quick, and how the unions are actually making teachers look bad right now. I think you and I and everybody that is watching this can understand that most teachers are excellent people, doing the best they can for students, doing the best they can in the system that they're stuck in right now. I always want to argue that it's the system that makes it as hard as possible for teachers to do a good job in the public school system. It's not the teachers themselves, it's not their motives. They want to do the right thing, but the teachers' unions are not representing their views adequately. And you're seeing things like these groups that are these teachers' unions from big cities grouping with the Democratic Socialists of America. Obviously, there's a lot of teachers. I would say the majority of teachers are not wanting to be affiliated with the Democratic Socialists of America. They want to identify as socialists themselves. There's a lot of conservative teachers in the K through 12 education system that I just want to point out that are not being adequately or accurately represented by these unions. And we see a lot of weird things going on just in the past couple of days. Yet yesterday, we saw the Milwaukee Teachers Association. They were had a lot of their members on a live stream yesterday, and they posted this all over their Facebook, actually creating fake tombstones of they're saying here's like a third grade child who died from, the virus and stuff. And what they're doing is they're protesting reopening by using fear mongering, and they're getting to these tactics to where they're creating tombstones of children, and
I saw that.
and it just seems kind of low to go there. And I think most teachers are seeing this, and they're saying, like, I'm embarrassed for I'm a teacher in this system. I don't support this behavior. I think it's beneath the the teachers unions to be doing this. And then we're seeing in Arizona, they have something called 6 days of action. And I think today they're doing a march to the Capitol. I'm actually pretty 99% sure that today is the day that they're doing that, because it aligns with these other groups that are having this as their national days of resistance. But they're marching to the Capitol. And yesterday they told their members to write fake obituaries to the Governor Doug Ducey in Arizona, again, to protest reopening. They also said, if you don't want to do the obituary thing, here's an instruction manual of how to write an epitaph, trying to do they had templates for making tombstones in Arizona as well. They had templates for the obituaries. And a lot of people were looking at this and saying, this isn't who I want to represent me, as a teacher.
Timing is weird. I mean, we're talking like in 2 weeks, these kids are going back to school, right? And still yet they're still having meetings on whether or not that's going to even happen or not. I mean, most of these parents they have no idea what's going to happen, but it does bring to another point. I think a lot of people, when you're saying the money goes back to the parents, that argument on some of my posts have been, well, that's dangerous, because what if these parents spend it in a reckless way, and what about the safety of these kids?
Yeah. Like, that's so reckless as compared to not reopening the schools and them still getting your money. I mean, how much worse can it be, right? But then also, these education savings account programs have safety mechanisms. I tend to trust the parents on a whole to make better decisions than the bureaucrats in the education system. But the reality in practice, when these programs get passed, is the money goes to scholarship granting organizations that then gives it out to the families in these education savings accounts, and they have safeguard mechanisms in place against fraud. And if let's say a family goes and buys a big screen TV, that family can go to jail for spending the money fraudulently. So that's a huge risk for a family to do so. And look, it has to be used on government approved education expenditures. And I would argue, even without these safety mechanisms, safeguard mechanisms in place, which they are everywhere where we have these programs, I would argue the families do actually do a better job than the alternatives, which is the bureaucrats in the government run school system that waste money year after year and that want more money without even reopening the schools in person this fall. So that's my quick response to these arguments about not spending the money wisely, or and then also, people are arguing about safety of the children in the household. Come on, there's the latest report on this was a long time ago, I will admit, but it was in 2004 by the U.S. Department of Education, who estimated that about 1 in every 10 students will experience sexual misconduct by the educators in the school system themselves by the time they graduate from high school. So we can't act like there isn't dangerous stuff happening in the school system. This is a Department of Education report right now. You can also look at Choice Media. They have a website called sexualabuseinschools.org. This is happening daily. They're updating these reports of crazy things happening in the school system with the educators themselves. And I just want to point out, this isn't all educators, but there are bad apples in the school system that far too many students are subjected to. Whereas in the household, they want to be around these people who who are doing these things, and I'm not saying that all educators are doing this, but there are still bad apples in the system who are doing these. And this doesn't include all of the abuse that goes on with other students, with the bullying and the gang activity and drug activity going on in the school system as well. So the students may experience some safety issues in the household, and sometimes that's obvious, that's certainly going to happen, but we can't act like it doesn't happen in the schools as well. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good.
Well, I don't think that we should be making these because some of like the comments on my post are like, well, we got to get these kids back in school, and they need two meals, and and I'm going, this is becoming a daycare. I mean, this is becoming a deal where it's the government. I mean, it can't be, when it comes to mind, it's like we can't have the government taking care of us from cradle to grave, to where it's two meals and safe. We have to have this and that, and then the next step is I mean, it's become a daycare. I mean, at some point, when are the parents going to take responsibility? You know what I mean?
Well, we shouldn't make policy prescriptions based on the exceptions rather than the rule. We shouldn't use extreme cases. I mean, we saw this with the attacks on homeschooling earlier this year by Harvard University's Elizabeth Bartlett calling for a ban on the practice. She calls it a presumptive ban, but I would define it as a ban outright, because she says even if you're deemed worthy to homeschool your children in your own household, she would still require those families who are deemed worthy by the bureaucrats or the elites in society to send their children to the public school system for at least a couple of courses. I would call that an outright ban on homeschooling, because I would define homeschooling as having 100% of that education happening in the household and through other community activities, and not being forced to use the government-run school system. Whereas Elizabeth Bartlett, in her calls for a presumptive ban, she's actually calling to force people to use the public school system, which I think would be absolutely ridiculous. And look, when it comes to families, and the daycare conversation is actually really interesting right now. I'm glad you brought it up, because I think school closures right now are highlighting what a lot of us in the movement have known for a very long time, that one of the main benefits of the public school system is that child care service. I'm not saying that's the only benefit of the school system or the only benefit of the education system overall. Children are obviously learning things as well, but when you look at the main backlash against the closures back in March, the first backlash was about where am I going to, how am I going to work, because I have to have a place to watch my children. And it wasn't about, oh my goodness, my children aren't going to learn things right now. I mean, that was kind of a secondary thing, but people's immediate need, their more innate need was to have somewhere to watch their children. And then also we saw a lot of backlash about the food services with the free or reduced lunch system in the United States, and people cared more about getting the lunch services provided than the education that they were missing out on. And so that's not to say that that's the only benefit of the school system, but that's kind of what a lot of people have theorized about. The school system is kind of like a daycare system. And again, that's not the only benefit there, but that is a benefit. And look, you're seeing it in the calls to reopen as well. People are saying we need a place to watch our children. We need to get back to work. They are talking about the education stuff as well, but it seems like they're more so highlighting this benefit of daycare. But the other thing is we have certain areas of the country, and I will say that there are 3 school districts in Arizona that I know of already. I'm not sure of Oklahoma. I'll have to look into it. But South Pasadena, California is also doing this, and other parts of the country. But they're actually reopening elementary schools and some middle schools, and they're calling it childcare center. They're calling them daycare centers, childcare centers.
Yeah.
And this is the same time that the schools would have been open. Austin is doing this in Texas as well. And they're reopening the schools, and they're charging families at least $160 a week. I've seen as high as $210 per child per week. And they're saying, okay, well, we're going to reopen the schools. We're going to give you the childcare part of the service that we would have been giving you last year at the same time of the year. And, we're not going to do the education part. We're not going to call it schooling. But if we call it childcare center, if you pay us twice, then we'll reopen the schools. We're just going to call it something else. And so, I mean, it seems like the school systems are essentially double dipping, charging families twice. Yeah. They're charging families through the property tax system, and they're charging people out of pocket. And they're providing the childcare services, but they're not calling it schooling. And it seems like they're kind of profiting off the backs of families right now. And ACLJ has actually given a legal letter to these Arizona school districts, one in particular, Gilbert Public Schools. They're representing a family out there and arguing that it's unconstitutional for them to do this. Every state constitution that I know of in the United States has some provision about providing a free public education. And it's hard for them to say that, one, if they're not reopening the schools, and it's obviously wrong for them to say that they're doing that if they're charging families out of pocket for doing so. So I think in that legal letter that ACLJ sent to the Gilbert Public School District in Arizona, they gave them until today to respond. So I think they're going to take legal action if the school district doesn't respond by today. So be on the look. I want to tell listeners to be on the lookout for that today. I'll probably tweet about it after we get off once I find any updates from their executive director, Jordan Seculo. But look, even if the school districts aren't charging family, it's just ridiculous for them to be charging for something that's supposed to be free, that's already paid for the tax system. But it's also arguably unconstitutional for them to not allow families to use the school system by not reopening the schools, because each state, again, says that they need to provide. Some states even go further and say that the school system needs to provide a free and adequate or thorough and efficient system of education. And if they're not doing that, families should get their money back. Families should get school choice.
Do you think we'll start to see these schools, like, I mean, we're hearing this to where they'll start school as normal, and then here comes, say, September, October, to where they're like, oh, COVID numbers are up, got to go back home. So, I mean, they get their money because they started it, but they're going to have to go back home and go virtual. I mean, do you see that happening?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing more so is that they just don't want to open in the first place. I mean, look at DC. That's another thing I forgot to mention. DC's just announced a couple of days ago, the DC Mayor, Muriel Bowser, in I think it was maybe Friday, she announced this. They're not reopening until November 6th, which a lot of people, saw that and they're just like, November 6th, why are you waiting until after the election? Just doesn't look good optics wise. And so when questioned about it, the mayor, kind of played dumb and said, I don't know why you're asking me this question, even though the reporter said, I'm asking you this question because people are going to see this and think that it's kind of a political, thing going on. I'm not going to question anybody's motives. I don't know why they picked that date, but it was just interesting for the mayor to act like she didn't know why the reporter was asking this, and even though the reporter stated why the reporter was asking that. So just weird timing on their part. They could have done it right before the election. It would have at least prevented some of that pushback on social media and from the reporters in person as well. I'm glad the reporter asked her about that. But look, they're waiting until November 6th, and they're going all virtual until then. And they even said at least November 6th. So they may reassess at November 6th and say, no, we're not going to open until next year or something. Yeah. So, and look, I don't have problems with individual schools making that decision. I just want families to be able to take their money elsewhere if the schools don't.
Well, where can people find you on Twitter? And I mean, obviously on Facebook, they can type in Corey DeAngelis, but on Twitter and
same thing on Twitter. You can type in my name, but my handle is just my last name. It's actually right here.
Right there it is.
Yeah, so at DeAngelis Corey. I try to make it easier just to. So follow me there on Twitter. I right when I get the news on this stuff, I share it there before anywhere else. And I think I'm one of the first people to break a lot of these things. So
well, here's one I want to ask you. You knew I was going to bring this one up, the Tebow bill.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea.
Well, we've got, 30 some states have it. I'm just gonna be honest. There's a lot of people that would homeschool, that I know that would homeschool if it wasn't for the athletics. And so it's like, okay, we don't want to go the public school route, but we need the athletics. Well, my kid wants to be a 4-time OSSAA state champ in wrestling, for example, right? The only way you can do that in Oklahoma is to virtual school or go to a public school. They brought it many times to the floor, but it's never passed in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, I can tell you why. The homeschoolers, or a large contingent of homeschoolers, are saying, yeah, that'd be nice, but we don't want the government then having a way in of telling us how we're going to educate our kids. And that is they think that's a way in. And there's a larger portion of those people than there are homeschoolers who want to go the Tebow bill. But I mean, you got 30 some states who have already passed it. And I think a lot of people do want to pass it. But if the money comes, I mean, if we're paying the money in, we should be able to utilize that part of the public schooling, I think,
Yeah, so I just want to point out for the listeners, this came from Tim Tebow. I don't know if Florida was the first state to do this, but Tim Tebow was a homeschooler, and he played sports, right, for the local school district. So that's kind of the idea here. If you're homeschooling, you should be able to take advantage of some of the services that you're paying for through the property tax system. A lot of people forget that in the current system, without school choice at least, families are paying through the property tax system for something that they're essentially not using at all. I would argue those families should be able to use 100% of the services if they want. Let's say the entire school system, if they want to send their children there, and they are able to do so already. Why not allow them to use a certain fraction of those services as well? Maybe, let's say the extracurriculars come to be like 5% of the school system. Why can't a homeschool family take advantage of some fraction of? Why do they have to jump in all into 100% of the services? If they're paying for 100% of their property taxes, they should be able to utilize 50%, 5% of the services, including the extracurriculars as well. And I think this would be beneficial for the school districts too, because then they can recruit additional talent from the homeschool community. And so it could be a win-win, and it could be a win for the society as well, in that you'd have more competition with the football games or whatever sports that you're watching. Makes it more interesting for the society that's watching the game. So I think it would be a win-win. And look, I think a better way to do this is to have a school choice mechanism where the money goes into an education savings account, and you can use that for club sports, for example, or you could use it even to pay your public school system and say, hey, look, I'll give you 10% of my education savings account if you let me participate in the sports system. And that way you could use the other 90% for the homeschooling expenses that are not tied to the extracurriculars. And I think that's the best way to do it, just fund the student instead of the system. And I just had to point out before we get off this thing, because it's my go-to, just like we do with the Pell Grants and food stamps, the money goes to the individual family, and the family can use those dollars for a whole host of different providers of the service. We should do the same thing with education. Instead of giving the money to the government school system, we don't residentially assign people to government-run grocery stores with food stamps and say that those families have to use the food stamps there. No, we give the money to the families, and the families can pick Walmart, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Harris Teeter's. They can pick a whole bunch of different providers, and we should do the same thing with education. And we should do that with homeschooling as well. And to get to the argument about regulations, I do think that is a legitimate argument that we should be wary of the regulations that could come from these programs. But I think every individual family should be able to make that cost-benefit decision for themselves. And if you see that the regulations outweigh the benefits of the additional dollars, well, then you can say, okay, I'm not going to take any of the funding because I'm not okay with the strings that are attached. But at the same time, homeschool families that don't want those regulations for their own families shouldn't have the power to say, oh, well, you shouldn't be able to take any of those dollars to homeschool your own children. I think most homeschoolers understand that families should be able to make their own decisions for their families. So homeschoolers shouldn't, try to limit the options, particularly of lower income families who might be more likely to need the additional dollars, regardless of the regulatory environment associated.
Yeah, the Tebow bill is an opt-in bill anyway. So like you're saying, if you want to follow a certain criteria that they put in place, well, then you follow that. If not, well, then you just keep homeschooling.
Yeah, you don't have to do it. Yeah. I think that's the main selling point here, is that just because a certain policy is passed, it doesn't mean it's applied to all homeschoolers. It's applied to whoever uses the program, and it depends on what the bill looks like, right? It might not have a lot of strings attached. So why not be open to this idea when the reality is the alternative is much more regulated than these programs. The government-run school system that the child would otherwise be in is much more regulated than these education savings account programs. There may be some, type of nationally norm reference standardized test, but there may not be high stakes attached to it. There may not be a test requirement at all. It depends on the bill. but the government school system obviously has a lot more regulations than these homeschooling funds. And again, you can turn it down if you want. You don't have to accept any of this funding. And so I think that's why it's still a libertarian proposal. One, it's voluntary, and then two, it's voluntary for individual families, and also it's less regulated than the alternative, which is the government school system. And if this gets, on net, even if it is a regulated program, if this gets a lot of people into the homeschooling movement, this could also build political power for homeschoolers to defend against calls for regulations as well. Homeschooling is a small segment of the population right now, and if you welcome more people into that population, you'll have more political power with a bigger voting bloc and people to fight against this because there already are consistent calls to regulate homeschooling. Oh, yeah. Having an education savings account program isn't going to change that, but it will benefit you in having more political power, having more people affiliated with the groups that are defending on the legal side, including HSLDA would probably have more members, for example, and more power to prevent the enemies of homeschooling from overregulating the practice.
Well, you're from Texas. I know right now Texas, it is. I believe it's going to pass. From what I hear, the Tebow bill, they have enough support behind it. I think it's going to pass. Here's the other thing. We're talking about, basically free choice. That if it doesn't pass in Oklahoma, we're already exporting enough of our college graduates and our businesses and everything anyway to Texas. You're going to start seeing people. If it passes in Texas and doesn't pass in Oklahoma, you'll start to see families move to Texas. I'll promise you.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, right? It's we're talking about the Tebow bill, TEBOW, and you're kind of referring to Tebow competition, voting with your feet.
Right.
Spelled the same way, TIEBOUT, the economists from the 1950s who argued that localities compete based on a bundle of goods and services provided by the government. And one of those things that you're referring to is the Tebow bill. So that's interesting, isn't it? But yeah, people could vote with their feet and go to Texas, which wouldn't be a good thing for Oklahoma. You're right.
Yeah. So. Well, you're getting a lot of. I've just been watching. I watch your tweets daily. But Ted Cruz, Donald Trump Jr., Ben Shapiro. There's a lot of people that are retweeting your stuff. I mean, so there's no question. I mean, it's getting extremely popular, school choice.
Yeah, and I mean, people in the education freedom movement or the school choice kind of advocacy world have always known that families are getting screwed by the school system because they don't have any power, because the money goes to the building and it doesn't follow the child like it would in any other or a lot of other taxpayer funded initiatives like Pell Grant. Like even with Pell Grants, that's education related. The money goes to the student and the student can pick a public university or a private university. Same thing with the GI Bill. Same thing with pre-K programs. A lot of people who like pre-K programs and Pell Grants support vouchers for these initiatives because the families can choose public or private providers and the money goes and follows the child. But then they somehow, for whatever reason, oppose vouchers when it comes to the K through 12 system. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it doesn't make any sense until you think about it for a little bit. And the way that I've kind of bridged this apparent inconsistency in their logic is that in the K through 12 system, there's an entrenched special interest. There's a monopoly system that wants the system to stay as it is. Again, the money goes to the system regardless of the choice of the family. So you have a special interest when it comes to K through 12, fighting against allowing those dollars to follow the child elsewhere. Whereas in the higher education level, the norm is that the money already follows the child. Same thing with pre-K. People are paying out of pocket for the pre-K program. So allowing the money to follow the child doesn't harm a monopoly when it comes to pre-K and higher ed, but it does in the K through 12. So that's the only way that I've been able to bridge the difference in the logic between people who oppose choice for these levels, but then or support choice for pre-K and higher ed, but then for some reason oppose it when it comes to threatening the monopoly system. That's the only argument that can be made as to why there's this disconnect. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people are talking about it now because it's becoming clear now more than ever that families are powerless when it comes to K through 12 education. I mean, the schools for a long time weren't properly educating children, and families still had to pay for it, and they couldn't vote with their feet and take their education dollars elsewhere. And a lot of us knew that already. But now the optics are even worse for the school system, and it really just highlights that families have been getting the short end of the stick, to put it lightly, when it comes to K through 12 education, because the schools aren't even opening now, and they're having to do a lot of the work on their own in the household through this home-based education setup, either through homeschooling, and the money's staying with the school system. So families and politicians and everyone, Trump and his sons, are seeing this. A lot of people are seeing this, that families are getting the short end of the stick. I'll just put it that way again, that they're doing a lot of the work and they're not getting the money. And when you start to think about these other kind of either taxpayer-funded initiatives or just any other sector in the economy, all these other sectors are reopening, and the schools are fighting really hard not to do so. And I think the reason for that is because the schools get your money, at least in the public school sector, the schools get your money regardless. And the private schools, they're having to fight against the government trying to keep them closed. On the other hand, in the public school sector, they're more so fighting to remain closed. They're not having to fight off the government to keep them from closing. The private schools are wanting to reopen and serve their customers because they know they're going to shut down. With Walmart, for example, they have a strong incentive to reopen safely and effectively and in a timely manner, because I can take my money to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods. With the school system, they have every incentive in the world to drag their feet. And it's because they get your money regardless. If we had school choice in place, we'd have a different incentive structure in play. And I think we'd see schools coming up with really creative ways to structure micro schools on a micro level, or partner with other organizations to reopen schools safely, and to have more of like a blended learning and a hybrid learning model instead of just a fully online model that we're seeing in far too many school systems today. And so, I think that's why we're seeing so many politicians and big names, at least on the conservative side, calling for the education dollars to follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. I mean, it just makes too much sense. If your school doesn't reopen, you should be able to take your child's education dollars elsewhere. Even if the school does reopen, you should be able to take your child's education dollars elsewhere. But it's even more so obvious when the school's not reopening.
Yeah. Well, hey, I want to definitely bring you back on here again. I got another call coming up here pretty quick. Again, you can follow Corey DeAngelis at DeAngelis Corey Twitter. You can look him up on Facebook. I've been wanting to have this interview for quite some time, and this is my first time to really use StreamYard. So
it's a good platform, isn't it?
It was an awesome platform. Yeah, I was looking at it in another platform, and this is the one. Obviously, you're the one who just knocked me over the edge. I'm like, okay, we're going with StreamYard. So I love it. It's a great platform. It pushes out to YouTube and Twitter and LinkedIn, Facebook. It's great. So I really do appreciate you coming on. Is there any closing things you want to talk about? I mean, I want people to follow you, obviously.
I've reiterated it enough on this call, but look, we should fund the student instead of the system. The money should follow the child to wherever they're receiving education. If the school doesn't reopen, that's fine. No school should be forced to reopen. No teacher should be forced to return to work. But no family should be forced to fund a school system that's not educating their children properly. If a Walmart doesn't reopen, you can take your food stamps elsewhere. You can take your hard-earned money elsewhere. If your school doesn't reopen, you should similarly be able to take your children's education dollars elsewhere. That's the main point. That's the bottom line. And look, again, similarly with teacher strikes, I don't mind if teachers strike. But at the same time, if you're striking for policies that families don't agree with, families should be able to take their money elsewhere. If you're not educating the child, and if you're instead striking and not providing the service to the family should be able to continue sending money to the public school system, but they should also be able to, if they choose, take their education to a school system that is more adequately meeting the needs of their children. Educationally and otherwise. So that's if you follow me on Twitter, again, it's here at DeAngelis Corey, and I'm looking forward to being on the show again with you soon, Josh.
Well, thank you, Corey. I appreciate it. I could talk about this all day long. I mean, it's right up my alley. So we'll have you on here again. So you have a good rest of the day. And for everybody watching, thank you for tuning into this.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.